I have some tiny detailed objects I would like to duplicate in resin. This is totally doable with a silicone mold, and those are easy enough to make. YouTube has tons of videos in which people make silicone molds of stuff. But, like I said, these things are tiny. And to make your own molds, you need molds for the molds. Containers to contain the silicone. You can't just dump it on stuff. So, my first challenge was to find appropriately sized containers to make the molds in. My second challenge was that some of the things I want to duplicate have detail on all sides, which means I had to make a two-part mold. And a two-part mold needs registration keys to make the two parts line up correctly. For the container part, I decided to use these acrylic display cases. These ones open on both sides. Not all of them do. Which makes it possible to pop the silicone out after it's cured. Also, I can stack multiple layers to make it as deep as I want. Challenge 1? Check. For challenge 2, I'm taking inspiration from this Talk dice mold box, which has an acrylic plate for making the registration keys. The plate is placed at the bottom of the box before pouring the first part of the mold. Then that part is flipped and the plate is removed before pouring the second part. I figured some of the pieces from this insane clear jigsaw puzzle would be perfect for the job. Well, almost perfect. They needed to be trimmed a bit. But challenge 2 still gets a check. They say trouble comes in threes, so of course there's a third challenge. Some of the tiny dishes are hollow with small openings, and the handles have holes that go all the way through, which could cause them to get trapped in the silicone. To solve the handle problem, I used a water-soluble glue. I put a drop of glue into the middle of the hole in the handle and let it dry. This formed a thin membrane to prevent the silicone from getting all the way through and trapping the dish in the mold, while still keeping the overall shape of the handle. The hollow interior was a bit trickier. I used a cornstarch packing peanut, which is also water-soluble, along with plastic wrap, the stick part of a cotton swab, and some tape, to make some little swab-shaped fillers, which could theoretically be removed from the middle of the silicone mold after it cured, leaving the silicone itself hollow, and thus able to collapse and be pulled out of the tiny dish. Theoretically. Back to the puzzle pieces. I had to be selective about which piece to use with each tiny object, because it needed to have a large enough area to completely cover the surface where they would be stuck together. So even though I did find a few pieces that fit into the little sections of the display case without trimming, I still had to use some of the pieces that were a little too big. Most were close enough that I just needed to sand them a little, but one or two needed a good-sized chunk removed with a small saw. Both silicone and resin tend to find their way through even the smallest crack in whatever you pour them into, especially if you cure them in a pressure pot. So it's necessary to seal any cracks in your mold before you pour. For some reason, I decided to try using the same water-soluble glue that I used on the handles of the dishes for this. I was not very confident in the results. There were little gaps in the glue, and it wasn't drying. I should have foreseen this. It's not exposed to the air, so how could it dry? Anyway, I decided to reinforce the seal with tape. Using only tape would have done the job just fine, but I suppose I wouldn't have known for certain what a pointless waste of glue this would have been without having tried it. I used double-sided tape to attach most of the items to their puzzle pieces, and trimmed off any tape that stuck out past the edges of the puzzle piece. Overhanging bits of tape would have left weird little splits in the silicone. After a tedious amount of taping and trimming, that's 9 out of 10 two-part molds ready to pour. But the last one is a little different. Most cabochons have a smooth, flat back, like this one. But this little guy is special. This is a glass scarab made in the 1920s, and the back of it has the impression of little folded bug legs. I suppose the shape and texture might technically disqualify it from being a cabochon, but I don't know what else to call it. The detailed back doesn't sit flat against the puzzle piece, so I couldn't use double-sided tape to stick it on. Instead, I used this poster tacky putty stuff, which I shaped into a thin hoop just a little smaller than the scarab. It worked really well for sticking the odd shape to the flat surface, and even after it was stuck in place, I was able to make slight adjustments. It's not actually ready to go yet, though, so I don't know why I stuck it in there. The last time I used this putty to hold something in place for a silicone mold, it didn't seem to get along very well with the silicone. So this time I dusted it with cornstarch. I figured it would create a thin barrier between the putty and the silicone and prevent it from going all gummy and weird where the two were in contact. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but this white flower should have been attached differently. I should have used a tiny disc of putty or something else that would hold it up off the bottom and leave a wider gap for the silicone to go in, as well as an opening for filling the silicone mold with resin later. Oh well, that's hindsight for you. The remaining items were all tape compatible, but didn't need to be put on puzzle pieces. They'll just be top fill molds instead of two-part molds. The silicone I'd planned on using is kinda old. I discovered upon opening the jars that it was really, really thick, and stirring well before using really didn't help much. Part A came out of the jar at roughly the speed of a banana slug. At least until it left the jar. But a banana slug would move a lot quicker if it was falling too, so the analogy stands. But the Part A pour was downright expeditious compared to Part B. Seriously? Come on! It came out of the jar more like a sea urchin. I realized there was no way the wretched stuff was going to work for making tiny, detailed molds. But I couldn't just stop once it was in the cup. So I mixed it up, which was unusually tiring, and threw it in the vacuum pot. It was already half set up in the mixing cup when I got it out of the vacuum pot, so I just jammed a little carved stone cat in there in a desperate attempt to make it somewhat useful. As a side note, the way I usually measure two-part silicone or resin is by first pouring water into the mixing cup in the correct A and B measurements, and marking the water levels on the side of the cup after each part is added, then pouring the water out and drying it off. My backup silicone says to measure by weight for some reason, even though the volume of the two bottles is the same. So I threw a scale into the process and then proceeded to not really pay much attention to it, except to notice when it had turned itself off. Then I got frustrated and attempted to recalibrate the scale with an empty cup and determine the weight of Part A, only to repeat the cycle all over again when I poured Part B. Volume or weight works fine for this stuff. Trying to do both is silly. The mixing and vacuuming was pretty uneventful. Thankfully, even though this silicone was just as old as the other stuff, it was completely pourable. I just didn't mix up enough of it. I've heard other makers recommend not scraping out the silicone on the sides of the mixing container because it may not be combined well enough to cure properly. Personally, I haven't had a problem with this, perhaps because I'm usually mixing small amounts and it's easier to scrape the sides while mixing, but it's something to be aware of. The dissolvable swabs were crammed into the tiny dishes with some difficulty, which I should have seen as a bad sign. And then a tiny bit more silicone was prepared off camera and poured in to complete all the molds, which then got put in a pressure pot to cure. This particular brand of silicone tends to cure a little softer than the others I've tried, and the surface can be a little tacky. I found a Reddit thread in which many others had the same problem, and the tackiness goes away eventually. Just another thing to be aware of. For some inexplicable reason, after pulling the molds out of the pressure pot, I continued filming on the floor. Here I discovered that the glue had finally dried, and deeply regretted having used it. So I grabbed a tray of water and spent the next few minutes dissolving both the glue and the packing swabs, enough to take everything apart. The glue worked exactly as advertised, which would be great on another project, but was messy and annoying on this one. After cleaning all the glue off, I started removing all the one-part molds. The rose cabochons worked perfectly, which makes sense since they were the simplest. The white flower had to be cut out of the mold, which I expected, but the resulting silicone flaps were a lot flimsier than I expected. The softer silicone really didn't help. Next came the teacups and the sugar bowl lid, which worked just as well as the rose cabochons. The water-soluble glue in the handles did its job perfectly, and the cups were easy to remove from the molds. The pitcher, however, was a fail. I made the swab too big and lifted it too far off the bottom, leaving a thick glob of silicone connected by a very thin part, so it broke off inside. The sugar bowl didn't fare much better, although at least I didn't have to dig the inner glob out with tweezers. It's a little easier to see what went wrong on this one. I decided to try repairing both molds. The next step was removing the puzzle pieces from the two-part molds, exposing the bottom, now the top, of the objects and a recessed puzzle piece shape in the silicone. And in the case of the Scarab, I needed to clean off all the tacky putty residue. I think the cornstarch helped. A little. Then I applied a thin coat of Vaseline to every bit of exposed silicone. This is to prevent the second silicone pour, part 2 of the two-part mold, from sticking to the first one. This is a very tedious but necessary part of the process. It's hard to see what is or isn't done, so working in a specific order or direction can help to avoid missing a spot. Any smudges of Vaseline that got on the objects had to be cleaned off. Otherwise, they would be transferred to the mold and then to the resin replica. Silicone is very good at capturing fine detail, and that includes smudges. Another layer of acrylic display case went on top and was taped around the edges. No glue this time. Then the two failed dish molds, with the dishes put back inside, were squeezed into two of the empty spaces. My camera was on the verge of death, and I was in a mad rush to finish the second silicone pour before it shut down, so I forgot to put on gloves. Gloves are highly recommended. Anyway, I poured one more layer of silicone, put smaller swabs in the dishes, and then it went back in the pressure pot. Because I only used tape around the edges, having learned my lesson about the glue, the silicone did seep between the layers of acrylic. That really wasn't a problem though, because the layers were easier to separate than they were with the glue, and the excess silicone was easy to trim off. After trimming, it was time to find out if the second attempt to make hollow molds with dissolvable swabs had worked. The results seemed promising at first. Yay, it worked! At least I would have a sugar bowl to go with the lid. But then I had to deal with the pitcher mold, which, after a great deal more effort and frustration, ended up being unusable because there was a hole in the silicone. Thankfully, everything else came out of the molds without any problems. To mimic the iridescent glass of the original Scarab, I brushed the inside of the mold with some mica powder, although this resin replica will actually be a little more colorful. I couldn't resist using the deep, vibrant green as well as the bronzy shade. But, like the original, the color will only be on the surface and the rest of it will be black. Time to mix up some resin. I used a medicine cup with milliliter markings on it because I only need a teeny bit. And because this resin is kinda old, like the silicone, it's starting to go just a little bit yellow. To counter this, I tried adding some purple alcohol ink, but since I was mixing the resin in such a small quantity, there was really no way to get a small enough amount of the ink to just cancel out the yellow. So it's light purple now. I used a terribly flimsy pipette to fill the dish molds, which I do not recommend. It took way too long and caused air bubbles. I also set aside some resin to color differently from the rest. For this tiny dab of resin, I'm adding a drop of red alcohol ink and some red glow powder just for fun. Well, and because I wanted to see how the glow powder shows up in tinted resin. Might as well research for future projects while testing these molds. Most of this went in the rose cabochon molds, and the rest made a mess as I tried to get it into the other flower mold with the flimsy pipette. Between that wretched thing and the thin flaps of silicone on the back of the mold, this piece was doomed to fail. The remaining resin was colored with some dark teal mica powder and unceremoniously dumped into the dice molds. The big ones, if you can really call these big. They're bigger than the other ones, anyway. I used a toothpick to persuade the resin to go all the way down to the pointy ends. This was going fairly well until I realized the resin was starting to thicken. The time wasted fighting with the pipette was coming back to bite me. I realized that A, I should have started with the tiniest dice, since those molds would be really difficult to put thick resin in, and B, if I did the Scarab last, like I planned, it might end up with flaws. So I added some black pigment earlier than I planned, and poured the rather thick and tarry resin into the Scarab mold next, because it was the main reason I wanted to make tiny molds in the first place. I have plans to make a custom locket for the antique glass Scarab, and I need a stunt bug. After that, the rest of the tarry sludge and the dregs of the red mixture got slathered into the itty-bitty dice molds with limited success. I had pretty much given up on getting good results with these at this point, but I figured something was better than nothing. After a night in the pressure pot, the resin was cured and ready to remove. Most of the pieces turned out great, although there were some bubbles in the six-sided die. The Scarab had a lot of excess resin flashing, but it came off really easily, and the mica coloring on the surface of the black resin turned out great. The micro dice turned out surprisingly okay. Only one was a total fail, and I kinda expected all of them to be riddled with voids. There's not much more I can say about this flower. I did end up trimming the back of the mold later, so hopefully it will be usable, but the back of any pieces cast in it will be kinda ugly. I suppose an ugly back is better than a gaping hole with bits of silicone stuck in it. I used UV resin to fill the void in the six-sided die, mixing in the same mica powder as before. This repair was fairly easy to do because the bubble was at the top and not overlapping a number. Had the bubble been trapped down inside or messing up one of the numbers, trying to patch it would have been such a hassle it probably wouldn't be worth it. Once the patch mostly cured with a UV light, I could pop it out of the mold and trim off all the extra before curing it again, just to be sure that it was fully hardened before sanding. I'll spare you all the tedium of watching me do the trimming. The sanding.
It's everyone's favorite part.
And the painting.
So satisfying.
Here's the finished resin replicas.